Hey class, today we're going to take up chapter 2, obstacles to critical thinking. We're moving here beyond some of the more formal and fundamental aspects of critical thinking. And we're taking up a topic that is no less important, but more informal. Part of it is going to be, psychological. So this is a very important part of the class because these are the sorts of obstacles that we are all vulnerable to. There's psychological vulnerabilities, that we are vulnerable to, and we need to be very careful when we are engaged in thinking about things in our everyday life. If we aim to be excellent human beings, then we should strive to understanding these vulnerabilities and to overcome them. Distinguish between these two types of obstacles. Category 1 obstacles are psychological. They are hindrances that arise because of how we think. Category 2 are philosophical obstacles. These are hindrances that arise because of what we think. Okay, so let's start out with the psychological categories and the psychological vulnerabilities, rather. This is the kind of thinking that is grounded in our interests, right? That tends to be best for us. What tends to be best for us is not always a good indicator of what is true. So when we think, ethically, scientifically, or anything that requires, an objective viewpoint, we want to be very careful about, about bringing in our own interest and allowing that to distort our thinking. Okay, now here's an example where, our the constructive tendencies of our imagination, tend to impose constructs, on the data that is presented in perception. So this is an example of pareidolia, right? And it was reported, by some Christians, that what they see, in this, this nebula is Jesus, right? And with this, crown, crown with a ring of stars. But it's just like a cloud, right? I mean, you just sort of, when you have a cloud, you can see all kinds of images in it because, our imagination is sort of imposing, concepts, superimposing concepts on the data. So, I asked one of my students, what he saw in this, nebula, and he said that he saw pizza, right? I mean, he must have been hungry at the time, but that's what he reported. So, and as the slide itself here, the text says, what would Hindus or Muslims, think they see there, and a non-Christian, right? I mean, a non-Christian obviously would not see Jesus there because Jesus is not part of their, fundamental beliefs. Okay, so how do we overcome self-interested thinking? Well, here's a couple of pointers. Beware of the urge to distort your thinking to save face. So, we all know how this works, right? So we don't want to admit, the truth a lot of the times because the truth makes us, look bad, right? And so we, engage in, in cooking up some story, which saves face, which, gives, the appearance that we want. Watch out when things get very personal. When things get personal, the passions, get going, and the passions can distort thinking. So, the thing is, it's not bad to be passionate. It's good to be passionate about issues. You want to care about the world. This is just sort of a, cautionary note, right? It's saying, when we get passionate, we tend to, engage in very heated argument, and we want to win the argument rather than, sort of engage in understanding. So, and this issue, there's an issue, a long-standing issue about whether objectivity is consistent with passion. This was actually a bias, among 20th century American scholars, Anglo-American scholars. They believed that if you were, passionate about an issue, then you couldn't be objective about it. You had to sort of maintain, intellectual distance, in order to be scholarly. So there was this Buddhist scholar named Edward Conze in the UK. And he, he was a practitioner of Buddhism, but he was also a scholar of Buddhism, right? And a lot of scholars in his day, critiqued him because they believed that you couldn't be objective if you were a practitioner. You couldn't be objective about a religion if you were a practitioner of the religion. I don't agree with that myself. I think that, it is possible to be objective even when you're passionate. We can apply some of these recommendations that we get in this chapter, as a matter of fact, to our thinking when we are engaged, in passionate debate. We do need to be careful because it is true that emotions, can distort our way of thinking. But it's just not true that being passionate about something, makes you not objective about it, or removes the ability to be objective about it. So there was a philosopher named Michael Polanyi, and he wrote a book called Personal Knowledge. And in his book, he argues that passion is actually constitutive of scientific thinking. All of the scientists who made great discoveries and contributions were all passionate about science. That's why they were engaged in it. So it's just a naive view to say that that we can't be passionate about a subject matter that that we want to maintain objectivity in. Not true, because if you weren't passionate about it, you wouldn't even be engaged in thinking about the subject matter. You'd be doing something else. So that view is a little bit more realistic in my mind. And again, this is all just, these recommendations in the chapter are very useful in this respect, right? It's good to be passionate, but we also need to maintain objectivity, and critical thinking standards when we engage in dialogue. Okay, so be aware, of these different ways that critical thinking can be undermined, when the alarm bell does go off, and we become passionate or emotional, then we want to intentionally apply these recommendations. Ensure that nothing has been left out. Avoid selective attention, confirmation bias, look for opposing evidence. Now, let me say a little bit about confirmation bias here. This is one of our greatest vulnerabilities, as human beings. And in confirmation bias, we tend to want to, or we tend to focus, on the information that supports our own point of view, and we neglect everything else. Okay, that's just something we do, right? We do it, by default, and as a matter of our psychology. Right. It's not because we're bad people. It's just because we're, vulnerable to that tendency. And so, we need to be aware of it at all times, and try and aim, for excellence in thinking, which would, require us to intentionally work against, this tendency to select information that supports our own point of view. We want to look for opposing evidence, and we want to be thorough as we research a topic, and make a judgment about a topic. Okay, so another obstacle that that we are vulnerable to is group thinking, right? Now, just let me say something. Give you a little anecdote about the power of the group. Years ago, I watched a video, and this gentleman was reporting on what it was like when he was at a Nazi rally. He wasn't an actual Nazi, right? So we're talking about, the Nazis in Germany, the Third Reich. He was an American observer, but when he saw everybody lift their arm, and to give a Heil Hitler, there were hundreds of thousands of people out there, and he reported that it was so difficult for him to not raise his hand. Like, he wanted to raise his hand. That's the power of the group. When we're in the midst of a group, there's certain group dynamics, that come to play. We want to be a part of the group. we want to be accepted by the group. We want to be praised by the group. We want the group to notice us. We don't want to go against the group, right? Robert F. Kennedy said it well when he said, that's social courage, right? Political courage is rare, right? This is a different form of courage than the courage in battle, right? Where the courage of the warrior. Political courage is where the individual is willing to stand apart from the group and criticize the group for the sake of justice, right? Now, few individuals are actually willing to do that, to speak against their party or to speak against their cohorts and to endorse very unpopular views that the individual thinks are just and true. So the power of the group is formidable, and here's some of the different aspects of this. Right, there's the fallacy that is related to group thinking here, and it's appeal to the masses. And this is where you give an argument that has the form thing is believed or being done by the group, therefore you should do it or you should believe it, right? It's a bandwagon argument. That's an appeal to the masses, appeal to popularity. One time I was given I was on listening to the radio, NPR, and they were saying, millions of people have taken, the test, this survey, on how to, achieve safety, in fire safety. I was like, millions of people have done it. I don't care, right? I mean, it's like that actually gives me a reason not to do it. But that's just me. But what they were trying to do is they were trying to appeal to the masses. They were trying to say, look at all these people that have done this survey. You should do it too. Okay, appeal to common practice, right? That's convention, right? Say something has been done, in a certain way, and it should continue to be done in that way. Sometimes that's called appeal to tradition. It's we're sort of at an interesting time right now because there's a widespread outrage at the killing of George Floyd, and this has happened in the past. We've seen it in the past, right? I mean, but it's like this is just the way things have been done for a long time, right? I mean, officers are sort of engaged in police brutality, and we see it on video, but nothing is done, right? They're not held accountable. Well, why? Well, because that's just the way things are done. They don't, so, from the point of view of, some in the law enforcement, some in our law enforcement institutions, right? I mean, they'd rather, keep the status quo and allow things to be continue to be done in that way. But we're at an inflection point, it looks like, where that's no longer acceptable, where, reforms, are on the cusp, being passed here, and things are going to be done differently, where police officers are going to be held accountable, for any, malfeasance or wrongdoing. Okay, ethnocentrism, right? This is another, sort of part of groupthink where, we think our group is superior, and the group, can be, an ethnicity, a race, right? We have white nationalism right now, which is back on the rise. White nationalism, is the belief, that America was created by, Americans descended from Europe, Northern Europeans, and, that Northern Europeans and whites are biologically superior to, every other person's, types of people in the world, brown, black, or yellow. It's a racist ideology, right? But that's what ethnocentrism is. I mean, at least, all white nationalism is ethnocentrism, but you might have some other forms of ethnocentrism, which are egregiously racist. We have some of this stuff going on in India right now. Hindu nationalists, taking over the government, and they are creating a society which is for Hindus, and they are doing things which are disenfranchising their Muslim population, like taking away their citizenship, their right to vote, the right to govern themselves locally, and things like that. So it's a very ugly thing. Ethnocentrism is, and we ought to be careful with it. Okay. Stereotyping is where we draw conclusions about people without sufficient reason. So, look, I'm reluctant to engage in some of these stereotypes because, they're sort of ugly. They might get one in trouble, but, I'll use one, against my own people, right? Mexican Americans, they eat beans, right? So, oh, you're Mexican, you must eat beans, right? Or you must like salsa on your food, right? You're Mexican, right? So, well, if somebody were to make that judgment, in relation to myself or about myself, then that would be stereotyping, because, they don't actually know me as an individual. They're just applying, what they know about, trends about the group, and then they're applying them to the individual. Okay. And sometimes we just get, stereotypes that are just way out of line. They could possibly be generalizations, right? They're more like false racist tropes. Anyways, let's move on. With regard to prejudice, bias, and racism, we do need to apply critical thinking to racism. I mean, it's one part, of a fight against racism, right? Against this, campaign, against racism in America. Racism has been a part of our society from the very beginning, right? And we had Jim Crow up until, the 1960s, and the social inequalities, and racial inequalities are being highlighted right now with these George Floyd protests. And I think that, a lot of good is going to come out of them because, it's pretty clear that, people nowadays, the young folks, of this generation, millennials, people like yourself, they don't tolerate racism, okay? Racism is evil, right? Judging people on the basis of their skin, their nationality, their religion, or whatever is evil. And, the young people in our society are no longer tolerating that, okay? And that's a good thing. I think that there's something to what Michael Moore said, which is that millennials are the first generation that doesn't hate, right? So now you can obviously find some counterexamples to that. You have a lot of white nationalists, out there, but, I do think that there is something to the idea, that, the typical millennial who lives in a multicultural setting, environment, is comfortable with diversity. You're comfortable with different kinds of people, and to, be racist towards any one kind of group is just, it's not something to be tolerated. It's intolerable. It's evil. Now, I actually challenged, some of my classes in the past with regards to this picture. I said, look, if you would have grown up in the South, in the 50s, you would be one of these persons who is jeering at this African-American young lady who's going into school here. And some of my students, didn't like that, said, look, I grew up in Texas, I grew up around all kinds of people, we had blacks, Mexicans, whites, and all this, Native Americans, the point here is not to sort of, throw stones at anybody. The point here is to highlight the fact, that what kind of people we have in our society is a function, of our education, is a function of their environment. If we are going to tolerate, racist environments, then we are going to have racist people, right? And so, what kind of people we have, and what kind of views they have about race, and multiculturalism and things like that is a function, of the environment and their education. So I think it's a good thing, that it's a beautiful thing, as a matter of fact, that we have people, who are out, thousands of people protesting right now. A lot of young people who are protesting, these racial and social inequalities. And again, I think nothing but good is going to come from them. Okay, so let's jump to category 2 hindrances. The category 1 hindrances were about, how we think, right? There were some, some psychological vulnerabilities within us that distorted our process of thinking in some fashion. Okay, now category 2 hindrances have to do rather with, what we believe, right? Our beliefs. So there are some beliefs, that are that stultify critical thinking, that make critical thinking unnecessary, right? Or not something that we need to do because of what we believe. So let's look at what some of these beliefs are. So when here's a concept that we're going to return to as we go on through this course, the concept of a worldview. Now, a worldview is like a conceptual scheme. Okay, worldview pertains to the most fundamental basic beliefs that we have with regards to what it is we can know, what is real, and what is right and valuable and worth pursuing. Right? We all have very basic fundamental beliefs, which are at the core of what we think. It's actually the prism through which we see the world, right? I mean, so sometimes, these fundamental beliefs can be of a kind that prevent us from thinking critically, and that should be recognized. So now, realism is the idea that that there is a real world out there, facts out there which are completely independent of my thinking, right? So or of our perceptions, right? So and we can discover these things, right? So there's a real world out there. Critical thinking is based on realism, okay? And the truth, as we think of truth in this class, is not dependent on what a person thinks. It's dependent on correspondence to a certain fact that is out there in the real world. Your belief that something is true doesn't make it true. Those are all sort of corollaries of this doctrine of realism, which this class is going to presuppose, right? Critical thinking itself is based on realism. Okay, so now here's our first view that can stultify critical thinking. It's called subjective relativism, and this is a view that what is true is dependent on merely on what someone believes, right? So your truth is different from my truth. My truth just depends on what I believe to be true, and that's it, nothing more, right? Truth is relative to persons. The subjectivist fallacy is when we make an argument that uses, the notion of subjective realism. Now, critical thinking is a process to determine whether something is true or false, right? Whether something is or is not the case. Now, if you claim that, what is true just depends on what someone believes, then there's really no need to engage in critical thinking, right? You don't need to engage, in statements that others make because it's just true for them, but it's not true for you, right? What's true for you? Whatever. Subjective states. I think a lot of people get confused about where subjective states fit in to this picture. Just because something is subjective or inheres in a subject or is about a subject doesn't make it subjective, right? If it were, then psychology wouldn't be a discipline, right? Because it's about subjects. It's about psychological subjects. But we have a science. It's called psychology. Okay, so there's a tendency for a lot of people to use this idea of subjectivism. Also, the relativism is prevalent right now, and I would discourage students from engaging in relativism, right? We have like a knee-jerk relativism. So if you take an ethics course, you'll sort of deal with this in more detail, but there's some reasons why it is, that subjectivism, is, or relativism rather, is, a view that is pernicious, that is actually going to, prevent us from making progress in our own society. Claims about subjective states are objective in that they can be either true or false. So for example, right, you might say, I feel pain now. It's true if you feel pain now, right? It would be false if you didn't feel pain. So you notice how there's, some objectivity even to the subjective state. It's a claim about a subjective state, right? Doesn't make it subjective, right? In the sense that, it has, no truth value, right? It's not susceptible of having a truth value. It's non-veridical, as it's said sometimes. No, subjective states, claims about subjective states can be, true or false. And the truth of the claim, notice, doesn't depend on what I believe. It depends on whether, in this case, I feel pain or not. Also, subjective preferences, right? This is sort of like the paradigmatic, example, right, of his subjectivity, right? I mean, do you like ice cream or not? It's purely a matter of preference, right? I mean, there's no right or wrong about it. But a claim about your subjective preference may be right or wrong. If somebody were to say, I don't like ice cream, right? That's a claim about my preferences, and it would be false because I do like ice cream, although I don't eat it anymore. I don't eat sweets anymore because my sugar was too high. Sugar levels were too high. Um, the preferences themselves, are neither right or wrong. They may be one way for one person, one way for another, right? But, the claims about them can be either true or false. Okay, so again, when you engage, in the homework and you see some of these subjective states, you have to, keep in mind, that there's claims about them can be true or false, even though the preferences themselves they just are. Okay? Another kind of relativism is social relativism. And this is a view that truth is relative to societies. Now, subjective relativism was, sort of grounded truth or falsity in the individual, right? Just whatever's true for the individual is what the individual believes. Social relativism, on the other hand, grounds it in a group. So if you belong to a group, and it's whatever the group, believes is true or false, that is true or false, or whatever the group believes is right or wrong, that is right or wrong. Okay, so now, what are some of the problems with these views? Both of them, subjective relativism and social relativism. Well, they imply that persons and societies are infallible, meaning that they can't be wrong, right? So, I mean, there's nothing to check what a society believes about with regards to what they think is right or wrong. They just have certain beliefs about what is right or wrong. That's it. They can't be wrong about that. Okay, so that's a problem because that prevents us from being able to engage in critique, of brutal practices. There are practices around the world to this day, right, that we wouldn't be able to critique because if we were relativists, right, because there's no right or wrong about it. So look, even today with regards to what's going on with police brutality. Right, if you're a relativist, social relativist, you say, well, that's just the way things are done in our society. Period. That's it. Nothing more to it. It's not right or wrong. It's just a practice. You're just describing, what it is that they do, what they think is right. We wouldn't be able to engage, in the critique of genocide, the final solution, the Holocaust that was carried out by Hitler. That was just, what their society did, and they were, implementing, what they thought was right and wrong. End of story. Nothing to critique. Okay, so relativism, this is one of the great demerits. One of the great weaknesses of relativism is that that it prevents us from engaging in the critique of practices that we know are brutal, right? So here's another example. Like a society might believe that that a woman's engaging in adultery should be punished, by stoning her to death. I mean, and it still happens, in some societies. Okay, is that right or wrong? You know what? I say it's wrong, right? And I'm not going to be relativist about it. No decent, humane society should engage in that kind of practice. If I were a relativist, I wouldn't be able to critique that society. I would just say, well, that's what they believe. That's their practice. End of story, right? And again, it's just one of the great weaknesses of relativism, and the situation, the existential situation, calls for critique, of that practice because it's inhumane. Okay, so also, a more formal problem with relativism is that it's self-refuting, right? So if you say that all truth is relative, and you assert that in an objective mode, then it self-references, right, and it applies to itself. So that truth is just relative. It's only can only be true for the individual who's making that assertion. It's not true for anybody else, right? But the mode in which it's being asserted, right, as a general thesis, is as an objective statement, which is supposed to apply, universally. And so, but it can't do that because, the content itself, comes back and applies to its own self and refutes the claim. Okay. So, and finally, we get philosophical skepticism. There's, we got to be careful with, the standards of knowledge that we use. Skeptics tend to use a very high bar of knowledge, right? The highest bar of knowledge you can get is certainty, right? Certainty with regards to, your beliefs. This is what Rene Descartes was aiming for in his meditations. He said that whatever I can subject to doubt, I'm going to reject as completely false, right? And so nothing can be accepted. So, Rene Descartes using, this high bar of knowledge, this high standard, was in a position of what's called solipsism, where the only thing that he can assent to was his own mind. He couldn't even be sure that other individuals existed, right? That's solipsism. So, he ends up, the first truth that he comes to is what's called the cogito, is, that I think, therefore I am, because, he is thinking he can, infer with certainty that he exists. That's the first truth that he gets at. And then from there he constructs, this whole system, which gets him God and, the world back. If we use the criterion of certainty, then we are actually going to know very little. I mean, if you think about it, what are the things you can be certain of, right? It's going to be sort of a very small class of things that you can be certain of. Most of the things, that we are certain of, are dependent on, like higher institutions, right? I mean, what do historians say about the history of Rome, and things like that, right? And so, the scientists, right? What do they say about, the nature of the physical world? So we can't be certain of those things, but they are scientifically grounded, and we have some good reasons for believing that they are true. And so we can't use the criterion of certainty, or else we're going to lose all of that. Okay. We do seem to have knowledge sometimes, right? Even though we don't have absolutely conclusive reasons, or we don't have absolute certainty. So we need to find, just that right standard, and this is what critical thinking is going to help us do, right? It's going to help us recognize, that there's degrees of probability, right? That there's degrees of confidence that we can have in the evidence, depending on what kind of evidence it is, right? And, and what discipline we're thinking about. Again, philosophical skepticism is a view that, we got to be careful with, right? If we actually, endorse too high a bar of knowledge, then we're not going to know anything. I'll give you an example of this. Sometimes, when you think about historical figures, right? Just think, okay, well, look, can you be certain that Jesus existed? Can you be certain that Socrates existed? Can you be certain that the Buddha existed, right? When you start thinking about these things, right? You ask that question, and I teach some of this stuff, right? So I've thought about it, students ask, how do we know these things? Historically, the way things are established is by evidence, right? So there's mention of, this figure, in multiple sources, right? So, the existence of Jesus is ascertained, by, his mention by Jewish, historians, the Gospels themselves are another source of knowledge. So there's a lot of knowledge that, the figure of Jesus existed. So we have very good reasons for believing that Jesus existed. Although, whether he was, the Son of God is another story, right? And I don't want to get into that, but as a historical person, right? Jesus Christ existed. You have more reason for believing that than he didn't exist. So radical skepticism, would say, well, how do I know that? I need to be certain that he existed, right? And if that's what you insist upon, then, then you're not licensed to believe that he existed, right? So we need to recognize, that knowledge is a social product, right? And we need to apply critical thinking standards, to that product, and ascertain, the degrees of probability, that these items of knowledge have. Okay, so this course will help out, with to that end. Okay, so that's it. I hope this helped out, and we'll see you next time.